Welcome, Shashank Nigam, from founder and chief executive of Simplifying. Welcome to Sustainability Week. Thanks for joining us. Why did you want to attend Sustainability Week?
Well, I've been invited here to speak about how aviation can decarbonize. I'm sharing some lessons from my latest book, Sustainability in the Air, which is in bookstores and on Amazon now, on how can industry become greener.
And I hear, so your new book, Sustainability in the Air, it's causing ripples in the airline industry. The airline industry is looking for ways to innovate, to decarbonize. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges? What are the biggest challenges facing the industry in that journey?
Yeah, it's not the easiest industries to decarbonize. If you think about it, you can book an Uber Green and a Tesla Model 3 rolls up. Or you can buy a Tesla if you want at home and you can drive green. But if tomorrow you try to book a green flight, you cannot do it. Actually, you cannot do it for many years. The first fully electric flight will only take off in 2028. And there's nothing before that. And that's also a short pilot route. The challenge is there are 29,000 aircraft in the air today. And in 2050, there will be 42,000 aircraft in the air. Almost all of them using today's technology. That means they are burning fuel, releasing CO2 and other gases in the air. The challenge is other industries are decarbonizing faster in the same period. So you have cars, marine, steel, cement, everything is decarbonizing faster. And the result is aviation's carbon footprint is going to go from 2 to 3% today to almost a quarter of global emissions by 2050. At which point, it's a very difficult conversation to have. That's the challenge we are dealing with today.
That's because it seems to be you're going to put a huge amount of pressure on the industry, right? Because already we hear about flight shaming. But when it's that level of contribution to carbon emissions, that could be pretty dire for the industry. But where are the opportunities, right? Where are the opportunities in sustainable aviation? You mentioned sort of electric planes. Where are the opportunities amidst all those challenges?
Right, so let me split this into good news. Where's the good news coming from? The book is all about innovators from within the industry, the companies that are transforming from within, and the outsiders who are Silicon Valley technology firms trying to disrupt the industry from the outside. And there are 4 key opportunities. There are things that can be done today to reduce emissions. For example, operational efficiencies. Simple things like taxiing on a single engine or taxiing on no engine can save up to more than 10% of the fuel and emissions for the entire flight on certain routes, because airports are big these days. You have to taxi all the way. Or things like avoiding contrails by just flying at a different altitude across the Atlantic on an evening flight can have tremendous impact just by looking at 2 to 3% of the total flights.
So that sounds like low-hanging fruit. Why is the industry not doing that?
The industry is doing that. So that's what they're doing today. They are focusing on operational efficiencies. They are focusing on younger, newer fleet and planes.
Right.
The challenge becomes what's next.
Right.
So if you look at short to medium term, because we are flying today's technologies airplanes, the only answer in town is sustainable aviation fuel, of which there isn't enough. So the industry needs to scale up. They have to find ways of funding sustainable aviation fuels. And let's be honest, it's not as profitable for big oil to make SAF as traditional hydrocarbons. So there have to be incentives by governments, like in California. There have to be sticks, like in the EU, carbon pricing, to encourage airlines and others to adopt SAF. And that's short to medium term. Then you go on further, where you have battery density increasing and allowing electric flight to take off, especially for short regional routes. That's a real possibility. And then go further, in the long term, by 2050, we will have hydrogen aircraft. Airbus is working on it. There's a UK startup working on it. And we are seeing a lot of innovation in that area as well.
Okay. What about other barriers to adoption? You mentioned a few, but maybe you could say a little bit more about some of the barriers to adoption that the airline industry is facing.
It's funding. It's funding. Airlines are traditionally not very profitable.
Yeah.
Profit margins are 2 to 3%. An airline typically makes $5 per passenger.
Is that it?
That's it. And that's not a lot of money to fund a $1 billion SAF plant or $1 trillion that's needed to develop a new electric or hydrogen aircraft. So airlines have to get really creative about who's going to fund this. And there is a way. If we split scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, an airline's scope 1 emissions, which comes by burning the fuel, is somebody else's scope 3.
Yeah.
So a Microsoft or a Salesforce or a McKinsey who's flying people all the time. There are airlines, which I've mentioned in the book, that are getting creative. So Microsoft, for example, has signed a deal with Alaska Airlines where, in partnership with 12 e-fuels supplier in Washington State, they will offset all of their staff's travel. So Microsoft takes care of funding the SAF for Alaska Airlines for all of its employees.
And then they can count that towards their
Scope 3,
emissions.
and Alaska counts it towards their scope 1. And this is what we need today, some creative thinking for what I call FOAK, first of a kind investment that
the first
catalyzes
movers,
the
right.
first movers, exactly. And that's what's needed today.
Okay. Is there a role for government policy in that? I don't know if the Inflation Reduction Act had any subsidies or any focus on the airline industry, or is it basically just to the likes of the sort of big companies to follow Microsoft's lead?
Right. No, the government has the most critical role to play here. The size of investments we are looking at is in the trillions. The entire aviation industry is worth 4 to 5 trillion a year. So the industry cannot do it on its own. So the mandates we are seeing in the EU are effective because carbon pricing will make flying on traditional jet fuel more expensive. So let's get SAF. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US has catalyzed a lot of biofuels startups as well as e-fuels startups, which are taking this funding to build up their initial test plants, their pilot plants, which they can then scale. LanzaJet is one that comes to mind, or 12, like I mentioned, Air Company in Brooklyn, once again has benefited. But an oversight in terms of government policy is creating mechanisms for customers to play a role. And that's where Singapore is a really good example, where Singapore has recently announced that by 2026, all flights landing and taking off from Singapore will need to carry sustainable aviation fuel, which will be funded by a levy on all tickets. It's not a lot. It's about $4 for short-haul flights and goes up to $16 Singapore dollars for long-haul flights. Now, I wouldn't reconsider flying out of Singapore for an additional $16 if it allows my flight to carry SAF. And that's, I think, going to be the holy grail of getting the consumer in as well.
It's a good point. We've been interviewing a lot of the people we've been speaking with have mentioned consumer demand. Are you seeing that in the airline industry? Customers of those who are wanting to fly, are they really showing strong preferences for sustainable flying, sustainable aviation?
Yeah. So, there's a say-do gap in this. Lots of airlines are trying to be transparent at the point of sale by showing the CO2 emissions of a flight. So United Airlines, which we mentioned in the book, when you search for a flight, shows you not just the price, but the aircraft type and the emissions. So take a flight on a 787 and your emissions are going to be way lesser than flying on a 777 or a 767 for the same route. That level of transparency inspires trust, but does it inspire action? Not yet. And that's where I think innovation once again needs to come in, where the airline industry is unique, where 80% of emissions can be attributed to less than 20% of the flyers, which are the frequent flyers. So an airline will have limited impact, showcasing the CO2 footprint to every single passenger searching, but can have an outsized impact if frequent flyers were engaged to say, hey, how can you take care of your 35 flights a year or 40 flights a year? Let's talk about that. And I think that's where the conversation should be heading when it comes to engaging customers.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Shashank Nigam. Congratulations on the book, Sustainability in the Air. And I hope you enjoy Sustainability Week.
Thank you for the questions.